Welcome to yet another podcast on our channel, The Evolution of Thought. Here in this series, we will strive to tackle the big questions of life and reality, like what is consciousness, what is truth, what makes us inherently good or bad, do we know anything at all? And if yes, how do we know what we know? We live in an age of science where some people scorn philosophy. In these times when colonization of Mars or quantum excitation of the Higgs field is all the rage, philosophers sometimes get a bad rep. But in reality, the scientific method traces its origins all the way back to Socrates and his habit of questioning even the seemingly mundane. So, yes, science and philosophy might have digressed over the years, but they have more in common than you might think. Just remember this: before there was science as we know it, there was philosophy. In fact, everything was philosophy. As we move forward with creating this series and you with listening, it would remain our endeavor and aspiration that you learn to focus not on what you know or what you believe, but rather on why and how you know or believe what you believe. If nothing else, you'll be able to better understand the strengths and weaknesses of your own ideas as you pour your heart and soul into the world. Well, maybe we can't promise any miracles, but that should hopefully make you better anything: a scientist, a family man, a corporate worker, or just the consumer of delicious, although calorie laden snacks. In the last podcast, we discussed the following: the landscape of philosophical thought in pre Socratic times, especially in Greece. Now, there are more pre Socratic thinkers that we could possibly mention, but we discussed a few prominent ones, a rogues gallery of natural philosophers, if you will, who left behind the biggest impact. We touched upon Thales, the first known philosopher, most well known for his chiseled looks, entrepreneurial spirit, and his idea that everything around us is made up of water. We talked about Heraclitus, the angry and sullen genius who came up with the idea of flux theory, not very dissimilar from the well-known thought experiment in the philosophy of identity, the ship of Theseus. Heraclitus also managed to piss off Darius I, king of Persia, with his rudeness before dying a sad death in a cow manure cocoon he fashioned for himself. Lastly, we spoke about Democritus, a well-educated, well-traveled pre-Socratic Greek philosopher, but most famously remembered as the atom guy for his formulation of the atomic theory of the universe. In today's podcast, we have a lot of interesting stuff in store for you. So without further ado, let's get into it. I want to introduce my co-host, Pramay. Say hello.
Hey, Sid.
Hey,
Hey, Sid.
how's it going? Good?
All good? Yeah.
Yeah. So let's get right into this podcast for today. Bear in mind, we are still in the pre-Socratic age. So as we trace the evolution of thought in ancient Greece, Socrates isn't born yet, but many great and at times weird thinkers came and went before him. One guy we want to start today's podcast with is well known for a mathematical contribution every child must learn in a high school math class. His name is Pythagoras, and he gave us the Pythagorean Theorem of right triangles. Pythagoras, aside from probably Thales, is the most well-known pre-Socratic philosopher today. I mean, it is fair to say that this guy is a household name, the triangle guy. The life and times of Pythagoras is shrouded in mystery. Not a lot is known about him accurately, and yet plenty of stuff is attributed to this guy. It is probably fair to say that Pythagoras studied the philosophy of Milesians like Thales and Anaximander, who came before him, but he was at the same time a much more mystical thinker himself. Or to put it plainly, he was a cult leader. Records about Pythagoras strongly suggest that he believed in reincarnations. There's nothing crazy about that. What is crazy, though, is that apparently he outlawed beans. Yes, you heard that right, beans. In his minds, beans were probably impure. Well, most likely historians love to debate this bean thing about Pythagoras, but what we know for sure is that he was a vegetarian. Nevertheless, aside from cult building, his actual philosophy itself wasn't so crazy. He is believed to have introduced the notion of idealism to natural science. Idealists generated abstract models of perfect stuff. This was unlike earlier Milesians who were largely materialists, and they started theorizing about the actual stuff. Now, in terms of math itself, Pythagoras and his idealism triggered a shift from practical arithmetic that came from Mesopotamia and Egypt to a new pure geometry. For Pythagoras, numbers were not simply a way of counting things. In fact, numbers were sacred for him. He firmly believed that he could explain everything under the sun using just numbers. However, perhaps his biggest contribution to science was the role of mathematical proof. Prior to him, it is believed that Egyptians and Babylonians knew about Pythagorean triplets, that is, whole number solutions to the Pythagorean theorem, and that was extremely practical and useful. It was used by ancient engineers who built stuff, but Pythagoras understood it and he proved it in a purely abstract and mathematical way. Now I want to bring in my co-host here, and we let's discuss a little more about life and times of Pythagoras.
Yep. So Pythagoras was a typical philosopher of the time. He was born rich, traveled a lot, and we've talked about multiple other philosophers in the last podcast who did the same thing. Uh, he was Greek, but he traveled to Italy, and that's where he set up his commune or cult, or a group of people living together and worshipping Pythagoras and uh, everything that he believed in and everything that he came up with. It's also interesting to talk about when we are talking about Pythagoras, we are essentially talking about Pythagoreans. So it's all the people in the commune, and this is because we don't know who came up with what. It's just what came out of the commune that we know. So the Pythagoras theorem may be something that came up by someone else in this commune. And you talked about math earlier. So for the ancients, math was it was not a subject to be studied. It was not a means to an end. It was a practical thing. So you and I know about Pythagoras theorem as it being a square plus b square equal to c square, or squares of the sides of the triangle being equal, the sum of the squares of the sides of a triangle being equal to the square of the hypotenuse.
Right.
But when the Pythagoreans thought of it, it was literally the sum of the areas of squares built on the sides of a right triangle is equal to the area of a square built on the hypotenuse of a right triangle. And that's exactly how they came up with this.
Exactly.
So,
And then that is actually what it is, like sometimes
yes.
it's pretty obvious, sum of square of a side is pretty much this, the area of a square that you can build off of that side. But for us, sometimes we just look at it in a purely like a formula.
Yeah.
But for them, it
Yeah.
was, it was real life stuff.
Yeah. For them, it was all very, very practical. Math, numbers, anything that they came up with was just a representation of something physical. So, uh, um, so anyway, I digress. But and Pythagoras was also almost obsessed with this concept of ratios or perfect proportions. He had this theory, and the Pythagorean theorem is one of the effects of those theories, that everything is in whole number proportions to each other. So we're talking about 2,500 years ago. They didn't know about irrational numbers. They didn't have complex numbers. They didn't have pi. They just had rational numbers, and that's all that's everything that Pythagoras believed in.
In fact, Pramay, if I could just, interrupt you for a second. I was reading about this somewhere, and, Pythagoras, in fact, he, as you rightly pointed out, he believed in whole numbers and he really appreciated whole numbers. And in fact, he had this tremendous disgust for irrational numbers, which, by the way, if you were a part of those times and if you lived in that area, you had to be really inside the inner circles of his commune to even know that something like an irrational number existed. It is believed that, he absolutely hated the square root of 2, for instance, which is an irrational number.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's how far it went, his love for whole numbers and his distaste, if I can put it like that, for irrational numbers.
And the square root of 2 was actually his biggest failing, because that's where his most famous theorem was actually used to prove everything that he believed in wrong. Because the theorem is squares of the two sides of a right angle triangle sum of the squares of two sides of a right triangle triangle is equal to the square of the hypotenuse. So the people who were thinking against him uh, just gave a basic example of take a right angle triangle with the base and the height equal to 1, the most basic right angle triangle.
Exactly.
And they asked him to tell what the ratio, the whole number ratio was for the hypotenuse. Now, as we know today, the square root of 2 is not a rational number. It cannot be represented as a whole number fraction. And he spent his life trying to prove it. He spent his life trying to get an accurate figure for that. He never could because it's impossible.
Yeah.
So it's funny how the Pythagoras theorem also represented something that the most basic form of the Pythagoras theorem could be used to prove everything that he believed in wrong.
Yeah,
But
make
anyway,
him really mad and make him really mad at the
yeah,
same time, to the extent that
yeah,
he felt he had to guard this sort of secret that irrational numbers do exist, and you had to
yeah.
be really inside the core unit of his commune to know this stuff.
And it's so talking about the fractions and the theory of ratios and proportions. It's said in many books about Pythagoras that this actually came up through music and through sounds, and you see this represent itself in music because an octave is essentially comprised of 8 distinct notes. So the story goes that he was sitting at a blacksmith, and there was this blacksmith who was hammering the anvil with different uh, tools, and every time, so there were two specific tools that had the same note, but they were exactly one octave apart. And that is what struck this idea in his mind that everything is in proportions. And then he studied that and he came up with the theory of octaves. And that's something that was used for thousands of years. It was used in chemistry to come up with the first organization of elements. It's still used in the periodic table. So
Exactly.
Mendeleev's periodic table, the law of octaves before him, that was all a direct result of Pythagoras's theory of proportions.
Yeah, and
So
the interesting thing is that now this stuff, because it is so well known and it is ingrained in our minds, it seems rather obvious and trivial, maybe. But yeah, it's really a testament to the fact that he was so patient and aware that in those times, because now it seems obvious, but back then, when he first sort of, when he was sitting there and listening to blacksmiths hammering away at the anvil, and to deduce something so profound from that rather mundane experience is pretty incredible.
yeah, I mean, it's like you and me sitting here today and coming up with a theory about the relationship between uh, the Andromeda galaxy and the Milky Way galaxy, and that being accurate, very accurate. It's something that you may think about, but it's very difficult to understand it. And 2,500 years ago, these basic mathematical concepts were very difficult to understand. And the Pythagorean theorem is universal. So you take a right triangle anywhere in the world, anywhere in the universe, and it will still hold true. So coming up with these profound universal truths when numbers were just physical representation of things was beyond genius. So all credit to him. He might have been a cult leader. There are the crazy bean stories about him, and there's a story about how he almost died. He actually died because of he didn't want to enter the field of beans. But all of that set aside, he was clearly a brilliant thinker. He was a magnetic personality because can you think of anyone who can convince 300 people to live on a farm with you, do everything that you say, almost worship you, everything that they think about is credited to you, There are very strict rituals in place because that is exactly what the lifestyle was in this commune. You had to be a vegetarian. You could not eat meat. You could not. You had certain ways of living. Uh, so he was clearly a magnetic personality.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. In those times, to convince people to give up their own beliefs and sacrifice their own way of life to live with him. I mean, obviously, he must have had an incredibly magnetic personality and, a way of convincing people, which in fact led to the establishment of this commune in the first place. And I think it's also important to point out that, when we talk about a cult in today's world, there is sort of a negative connotation to it, because people think of cult leaders as individuals who do it for power, money, or influence. But the same cannot necessarily be said about Pythagoras, because did he start a commune for power, money, or influence? Probably not, because as we know, and as things stand, he actually believed in what he believed in, and his work with mathematical numbers and mathematical proofs. To him, it seemed like he was on the right track to explaining the nature of reality with simply numbers and math, music, and astronomy. So I think that's a big credit to him, that he did not necessarily do this for power or money or influence. And that's why, although he was a cult leader, if you could use that term, but it was not necessarily in a negative way. And in fact, it shows something remarkable about this guy, that all these years back in the past, he had this tremendous appeal. And people actually, it's not like he went after people with a sword and sort of confined them in his commune. People wanted to be a part of his commune, so there was a tremendous respect for him as well. And also, with respect to his Pythagorean theorem, I think, yeah, it's remarkable, as you pointed out, Pramay. It's remarkable that he realized that it's not just that this square of two sides of a right triangle is equal to the square of the hypotenuse, but to realize that it applies to all right triangles
Yeah.
without exception. I think that was the biggest win. And yeah, it the in those times, as we pointed out before, this was something that was known to some extent in Egypt, or Babylonians knew about this as well, about Pythagorean triplets. But in those places, it was sort of more appreciated for the practical value of it. That okay, you could use this to maybe build something, or for some sort of engineering. But for Pythagoras, he was more interested in the absolute sort of abstract nature of the essence of triangles. And
Yeah.
the practicality for him was a byproduct. He was more
Yeah.
interested in the abstract essence of a triangle, or math for that region. So no wonder these proofs and these mathematical proofs and these mathematical insights that he had, it seemed like magic to him and to his followers in the commune.
And even if you move beyond math, his impact was profound. We'll talk about it in a future podcast, uh, but Plato was effectively a Pythagorean and uh, a disciple of Socrates mixed in. So if you look at Platonic solids, the five regular solids, that was actually a Pythagorean concept. They came up with it. Plato just wrote about it, which is why we call them Platonic solids today. So his impact on math uh, continues to this day, but his impact on philosophy also was very, very, very profound.
Absolutely, I agree with you, Pramay. And this will, in some ways, reflect in our own podcast as we go through this journey. I think
Yeah.
on multiple levels in the future, we will, in some form or the other, come back to Pythagoras and sort of attribute certain qualities or certain works of future philosophers that we discuss to this guy. So now, moving on, probably the last thing I want to discuss in today's podcast would be, aside from math, music, and astronomy, and the fact that he was a cult leader, he also believed in incarnation, or rather reincarnation. And he strongly believed in the concept of transmigration of souls, which perhaps not a lot of people agree with today, but especially for us, being from an Indian background, I think that is something which is reincarnation is something which is a huge part of our own history and of our own scriptures and Indian philosophy as well, as we will see in future episodes once again. But yeah, maybe you could share your thoughts on what he why he felt that reincarnation was indeed something that happened.
So uh, he was he he's one of the stories that gets attributed to his belief in reincarnation is that there were some people around him beating a dog up, and when the dog was basically crying out in pain, he heard the voice of one of his dead friends, and he truly believed that his friend had been reincarnated as that dog, and that's where they talk about this being the origin of his belief in reincarnation. But I have a slightly more controversial opinion, because if you look at history at this time, this is what, around 550, 520 BC. So the Phoenician trade had already reached its peak. I think there was pollination of ideas across the East and the West. So these are ideas that were very, very, very prevalent in Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion at the time. This thought about reincarnation and transmigration of souls, vegetarianism, being kind to animals. All of these philosophies or beliefs had already originated in Asia, and there was trade between Asia and Greece or Europe. I do think that there was some cross pollination of ideas, because it's very difficult to believe that Pythagoras comes up with this at the same time as Confucius is thinking about the same things in China, or the Buddha is about to achieve enlightenment in India. So it might be a controversial opinion, and I'd love to hear uh, views supporting or against it. But I think it's possible that his belief in reincarnation may have been seeded somewhere else. There's another theory about it, of it flowing from the Greek religion of Orphism, and that's a very interesting story as well. If you're into Greek mythology, so it flows from the son of Zeus, Dionysus, and Dionysus was actually, there are multiple stories around it, but one of the stories is that he was killed by the Titans, instigated by Hera, who was Zeus's wife, and then brought back to life. So by Apollo, there's a lot of interesting Greek mythology around Dionysus, but there's this religion called Orphism, which was uh, a few hundred, maybe thousands of years before Pythagoras, and they had the belief in vegetarianism. They had a belief in reincarnation, because they sort of worshipped Dionysus, and Dionysus was reincarnated. So there are these two theories of how and why Pythagoras believed in reincarnation. Uh, the most well accepted is the second one. I just threw out the first one as a thought experiment.
No, I agree with you. I think the second one is definitely more what people tend to believe in about Pythagoras and how he came to believe in incarnation and especially transmigration of souls. But I think the first one is also an excellent thought experiment for people. Something to think about, because as you rightly pointed out, Pythagoras, even though he was a Greek, lived in Italy, but he was definitely influenced by Egyptian ideas and ideas in Mesopotamia, probably even Persia to some extent. So it is not illogical to extend that and think that, there was some cross pollination of ideas that happened from India or maybe even China, but especially India, because, India and Persia have always been, sort of close, and there has always been cross pollination of ideas between these two areas historically, because they're connected through land. So in some ways, it could have definitely happened that he, knowingly or unknowingly, came to know about some of these ideas from sort of Oriental philosophy at that time. And yeah, it's definitely a great thought experiment for our listeners. And we would actually, encourage people to share their opinions about this in comments if they hear when they hear this podcast. So Pramay, I think based on based on some of the feedback that we got based on the last podcast that we did, which ran for almost 1 hour, I think one of the feedback that we got from some of our listeners, handful of listeners, I should say at this point, but yeah, that we should probably keep it a little shorter, maybe close to 25-30 minute mark. So with that, I want to conclude today's podcast right here. But I want to give our listeners a sense of what we will be discussing in the next podcast, which might happen in 2 weeks from today. And we will talk about this guy called Parmenides. And just to give you a brief sneak peek, this guy is considered the father of deductive reasoning. And he believed that true reality was one simple, unchanging reality. And once again, his ideas, at least in my opinion, are very similar to some of the ideas, some of the ancient Vedic Indian ideas. So we'll try to establish a link between the two in the next episode. I Because we will be talking about deductive reasoning, I think Pramay, we should also take some time to talk about different sort of philosophical ways and different ways of doing natural science. So maybe we can touch upon metaphysics versus epistemology. This is something we've done in
Yeah.
the previous episode as well. And then I think we can also spend in the next podcast, spend a little bit of time talking just generally about deduction versus induction versus abduction. And, we can give examples and arguments and counter arguments of all these different ways of thinking, because they are extremely, sort of widely used even today. And Parmenides was this guy who was the first to sort of firmly establish deductive reasoning. So
Yep.
that's where we will go in the next podcast. But yeah, do you want to add anything before we close this session today?
No, but as a part of the sneak peek, so when you think of Parmenides, I think of Heraclitus. Again, God complex, thought the world of himself, had some pretty crazy ideas, and again, brought in metaphysics as well as epistemology. And he's a very interesting character. So, would encourage people to listen in.
Yeah, and we'll have some fun in the next podcast. So with that, guys, we will close this podcast right here. And thank you for listening, and tune in for the next podcast when that comes up in 2 weeks. Bye.
Bye.